Sorry. Yeah, mind a window or two open?
No, go for it.
There's stuff going on.
Yeah.
It's probably it was.
Thank you. The later thing is very much verification of the problem, which maybe very good use of. Thank you.
That's the main sign of the university actually gives the base well.
Yes, so
I'm good, thank you. Yeah. I mean, it's at the moment, I'm reading me, but I'll come back down and then I thought I'd come along to the.
Yes,
Yeah.
we have got three companies in the building.
We've got to choose.
That's really marvelous. So to interrupt your reading of X4 set X.
thank you.
James?
So what do you do?
So no, I just
You had to get a job.
Yeah.
Another. Is you English?
I know I was doing bits of I was looking like around here, but it didn't direction.
Were you doing this work when you weren't actually in that?
So I was forgetting as well.
Well, I haven't seen it. Well, I did work okay with content. Because they, they're both at the university level, don't they?
Yeah.
And I think it was almost like I wanted to get into a contract, but there was kind of understanding that they were universities that kind of think around there now is possibly the three most recent volumes together, because the other one that came out. Oh, the one about Hankins and Travelers.
Yeah.
And certainly Alexia. Yeah.
And then
Yes, but also very good. What I saw by all these companies, the committee. No, well, I had this game. Really cool. Yeah, no. But you know, it's. Yeah, because she is not a sense of designate. And yeah, like community. Something not even ready. Okay, so. But no, it's not. You instead. Anyway, what Hugh is now going to have anything else to do? So, no. Everybody. So. As you see, it's different. But he's very good, and he's also got a lot of doing anything serious, which we're confident.
I went upstairs, with Richard, and I saw Richard that way along the corridor, and I see her just gonna drop down the stairs, but that was tears.
Yeah, I was talking to her about it.
That's a hanging. There's changing my.
I think we put something medical in my as it was, and we changed it as it was. It's like, no,
Well, I assume.
That means.
I don't There was a.
well, half of it.
And I feel home and introduction.
Yes.
Each time to change the plans.
I don't think it's nice to see you. Looking like honey.
Right.
Okay.
So it's a great pleasure to welcome an old friend of the faculty and old friend of the Cambridge Centre for Greek Studies, Johanna Hanning, who's visiting briefly from Brown University and is going to be talking to us today on tree time in Karkavitsas archaeologos.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you very much. That was an extremely fulsome introduction for Cambridge, if I remember correctly. Thank you. And yeah, this room, I'm a bit intimidated. This room, I always associate with people giving important talks about important things, but I don't really know if this rises to any of that. But does everybody have a handout?
And the microphone is there.
Do I need a microphone? Oh, for the Zoom people.
Zoom.
Oh, the Zoom. Oh, right. Wait, so do I have to stand over there?
Well, anywhere near it.
Okay. Okay. This sounds much more formal. Yeah, I envision, but hello, people of the internet. Where's the camera, Tim? Oh, it's over there. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, hello. Okay, so could I just ask, so has anybody actually read this? You have? Oh, some people have. Oh, Professor Holton, of course you have. Yes, yes. Yes. Okay, so I just wanted to say a few brief words about the novella. The translation of it came out in 2021, and that was keyed up with the bicentennial celebrations of the anniversary of Greek independence. But I think that the book sort of was largely buried in, among other things. I mean, the pandemic was still in full swing, and there was a lot of commemorative events going on in 2021. So it's really a privilege and an honor for me to be able to present a little bit of the book here, to introduce you to it if you haven't encountered it before. And if you have, I'll be suggesting an argument, an outline of an argument about something interesting I think is going on in it. So the novel, Karkavitsas' novel, The Archaeologist, which was published in Athens in 1904, and here is this is the lovely cover of my translation of it. It allegorizes the formation and the expansion of the Greek nation state through its portrayal of the once great Eumorphopolis family. And this novella is extremely heavily allegorizing. So any place where you can see something interesting in the name Eumorphopolis, whatever you see there and more. So for many generations, that family had fallen on hard times, but the novella begins as its most recent descendants are just beginning to rebuild their fortunes by taking back some of their land. So the members of this family, the Eumorphopolis family, really represent competing versions of Hellenism. So there's Aristodemus, who's the titular archaeologist, and he's this real physical embodiment of a Greek concept, a couple of concepts, I think. So there's archaeolatria, like a kind of antiquity worship, and another very interesting concept, progonoplexia, which is this sort of pathological overweening pride in ancestors. So Aristodemus, the brother in this family, the father has since passed away. He cares only for the family's illustrious and internationally renowned ancient past. This is his obsession, while his younger brother, Dimitrakis, rejects that past, or at least he does so at first, and takes a view of life that it's much more focused on the demands of the present age. Both brothers do have a very close relationship with the land, the ancestral Eumorphopolis land, but the nature of their commitments to the land differs very much. So just to set a little bit of the scene for you, in early passages of The Archaeologist, we find vivid descriptions of Dimitrakis' exuberance in the natural world. Right, this is an exuberance that really starkly contrasts with the dark and musty library life, familiar to many here and preferred by his brother. The first chapter dwells primarily on the interactions between Aristodemus and a group of 3 foreign scholars, the Sophoi, who have come to consult the Eumorphopolis family books. And that's a signifier for manuscripts of ancient Greek literature. And so late in, actually, if you look at the handout here, I put on it Dimitrakis's reaction to coming into his brother's study. And I'll read the English translation here, where he comes in and he says, "Oh, it's so musty in here. Don't you ever put down these dusty old books just for a second, brother, and take a look at the world around you? For Christ's sake, whenever I come in here, I feel like I'm walking into a tomb." And then at the end of it, we get a real contrast where Dimitrakis flings open a window and looks outside, and we get this extremely vivid depiction of this exuberance, where he says, or where Karkavitsas describes with great vividness, "With eyes wide, he lifted his gaze to the outside, as if longing to bathe his soul in the marvelous panorama. Outdoors, the fields were turning green, dewdrops frolic like bright souls flitting to and fro. The forested mountains seemed to slumber beneath the diaphanous gossamer mist." So it's interesting, these two brothers, as you see in other cases of literature, also including Greek literature, there's two brothers who really embody there's a spiritual contrast between them. They embody the two opposite ends of a very kind of polarized spectrum. Aristodemus himself, he's presented as wan and anemic, whereas one of the scholars, the aptly named Alamanos, pointing to German associations, he observes that Dimitrakis he had a robust bearing and was in the full flower of youth. Okay, so this is the kind of person, the more impetuous, healthy, excitable person who flings open the window and just takes in the world around him. So throughout the novella, it's going to be Dimitrakis who takes the greatest interest in cultivating and maintaining the land and in protecting it from incursions by the other farmers in the neighborhood. And within Karkavitsas's allegory, these other farmers, these neighboring farmers, represent neighboring aspirational nation states: Bulgaria, Serbia, Romania. And of course, there's the Ottoman Empire figures in, and we'll come to that. So Dimitrakis's hopes for the family's future manifest themselves in his dedication to manual labor on the family's lands, even when those lands fall into the hands of others. On the other hand, Aristodemus's maniacal excavations of his ancestral property are motivated by a desire to recover bones and marbles that lie buried and concealed beneath the soil. His obsession with extracting hard material from the earth speaks at several points to a familiar trope, namely the symbolic collapse of the distinction between human bones and antiquities themselves, especially marble stone antiquities. That rhetorical conflation is one that appears early in the Greek national archaeological discourse. And I think its logic has been eloquently articulated by my colleague at Brown, Yannis Hamilakis, in his 2000 book, The Nation and Its Ruins. So there, Hamilakis explains this kind of mentality as follows. This is on your handout. And what I want to emphasize, this is not sort of like how Greeks feel. I'm not trying to say that, but what Hamilakis is doing is kind of trying to give an account of an early and persistent archaeological discourse. So that antiquities come from the earth that contains the bones of the ancestors. Antiquities are bones. They're the marble bones of the body of the nation. The marble statues can speak, cry, and mourn. Antiquities come from the earth. The earth has been fed and watered with the blood of the ancestors, that same earth, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's going to be the masterpiece of a statue, the glory or doxa, kore, that Aristodemus's efforts finally uncover. With this statue is precisely the material object that he sees as proving the link between his family's past and the present and the future. And when Aristodemus, overseeing the workmen, has the statue uncovered, he explains to them that once upon a time, his grandfather had clipped Glory's wings, quote, to force her to stay with us forever. Yanatin anankasi namini pandamazios. So for Aristodemus, bones and stones are the enduring necessary proof of his family's greatness. In the world of the archaeologist, however, the collapse of the distinction between stones and bones takes a very sinister turn. On the evening of the day that Aristodemus and the workmen discover the statue of Glory, Aristodemus rushes home to share the news with his mother, who's a very interesting character in the novella. Unbeknownst to him, however, his mother has died, sorry, spoiler, a victim of his own cruelty. And as Aristodemus broods alone in the dark of his study, he notices he's sort of seeing around what he sees around him. The narrator describes that the column capitals, the lekythoi, the grave goods with all their dampness and dirt, emitted an unbearable smell of dug up bones. And we're told that as he gazes out at the excavation site where he's been digging up his family's land, so as he gazes out at the site in the moonlight, quote, the excavated dirt shone white, between the mounds, the ditches gaped like wide open tombs, end quote. So even the column capitals themselves emit the smell of dug up bones, while the archaeological trenches dug by Aristodemus and his workmen are here likened to open graves. This stone bone distinction is no longer the stuff of national pride, but of a frightening ghost story, which this turns into for a chapter or so. And so that I won't give the full thing away because there's an interesting twist in a quite literal sense at the very end of the novella. But what I do want to, I hope this was enough of a framing to be able to orient you to a little bit of an argument that I'm hoping to make about the novella and why I think it's one of the reasons that I think it's interesting today. So what I want to propose is that while Aristodemus adopts this familiar line that bones and stones link the past and the present and the future, in the archaeologist, Karkavitsas importantly and radically proposes an alternate material metaphor, and this is the metaphor of the tree, to account for the eumorphopolis spirit's endurance over time. Whereas in Karkavitsas's time, the contemporary archaeological discourse tended to prioritize antiquities as symbols of the past, what I would call, I guess somewhat pretentiously, the dendropoetics of Karkavitsas's archaeologist proposed the tree as actually a more appropriate model for representing Hellenic heritage. And it's this figure of the tree that suggests an alternative discourse for conceiving of history and of Hellenism. And this discourse, I think, actually anticipates the very recent outpouring of literature, both novelistic and scholarly, that invites us to turn to trees and to tree time as a means of both recognizing and reckoning with the climate crisis already underway. So within the novella itself, it is the character of Elpida, Hope, Dimitrakis's cousin, fiance, and teacher, who is most explicit in her adoption of this metaphor that I've outlined. In a crucial scene in chapter 4, Elpida offers Dimitrakis an account of his family's history that's entirely different from the one on which he and his brother have been raised. Elpida instructs Dimitrakis in that history by describing, she basically does an ekphrasis of a very elaborate embroidery that she's working on and almost finished, an embroidery of her own handicraft. And when it comes to this embroidery, the shimmer and the variegated color of its threads, along with the suppleness of the work's satin backing, all stand in sharp or soft contrast to the cold, hard, bare, and white stone of the glory statue that Aristodemus will later uncover and prize. But Elpida also appeals to another metaphor when she expresses frustration that Aristodemus is unable to see the folly of his hourglass-shaped view of time, so a view that values only the very distant past and the present day. And so this is a quotation from her complaint about Aristodemus, and she says, and I'll read the Greek, "Perni ti risa tu dedru ketafila, ton kormotu aparniete. Δεν του φαίνεται τόσο ζεύτος. Και δεν συλλογίστηκε ποτέ, πρόσθεσε η κόρη θυμωμένη, δεν συλλογίστηκε πως ο κορμός είναι εκείνος που δένει τη ρίζα με τα φρούτα." So it is ultimately this figure, that of the long-living, majestic, changing, and yet still enduring tree, which Karkavitsas prioritizes over Aristodemus's pursuit of ancestral stone and bone. And I think that the fullest articulation of this alternative metaphor actually comes in negative terms in the book. So within the framework of the novella, the actual tree that for millennia has linked the present and the past will be destroyed in the name of archaeology. Aristodemus's mother, Mrs. Panoria, might be the first human victim of her son's single-minded obsession, but her own suffering and death are foreshadowed by the violence that her son proved so willing to inflict on animals, plants, and the land. And the most pointed example is the fate of a mighty plane tree on the Eumorphopolis property. Urged on by the foreign wise men, and despite the pleas and protestations of Dimitrakis and Mrs. Panoria herself, Aristodemus brings the tree down with an explosion of dynamite in order to recover antiquities that he fantasizes are lying beneath it. He says, who knows what treasures its roots are concealing? I'll demolish any plane tree and even the house if I have to, this one included. And so the reader actually learns of the tree's fate in a very interesting way in a chapter in which one of the palace slaves of the character Khan, who's a stand-in for the Ottoman Sultan, one of the palace slaves reports the tree's destruction to him. And this is it's quoted at length in your handout. If you look at the kind of 2 pages, you can look at them together or put them across. But I do, well, I'm just gonna read it. Because I think it's important. And I'll read it in English. So, and I think that for this audience, you'll recognize the device quite quickly that I think is being used here. So this is this enslaved figure in the palace of the Khan, who says, there's no explaining what happened down there today, master. I saw and got all choked up. And you know me, master, I'm not the type to cry easily. But if your lordship had been there, he'd have done the same. Me? Really? Said Khan, knitting his brow. What on earth happened? Do you remember the big tree near the old man's little hut? The plane tree, you mean? And then he goes on into this speech. Yes, the plane tree, so big, not even 8 people could have made a ring around it. He wanted to uproot that too, Mrs. Aristodemus. His mother and brother were telling him, don't. Mrs. Penoria begged him with tears in her eyes. How is it bothering you? She kept saying to him. How is it bothering you? Have pity on it. No, he said, who knows what treasures its roots are concealing? I'll demolish any plane tree and even the house if I have to, this one included, he said. Leave it, my son, in God's name, the old woman begged. It gives us shade in the summer. It blesses us with coolness. I do all of my chores in its shade. Leave it, his brother was also saying. It too has a history. It was here that our forefathers would stop on their way home from laboring for Khan. Many of our own were hanged from its branches. Some watered it with their blood. Others nourished it with their tears. It's just as sacred as your rocks. No reaction. He didn't see his mother's tears, didn't heed his brother's words, but just looked right at the scholar. So was Sophie. They stood there silently and nodded, get rid of it. And when he saw that no worker was lifting a hand, he seized the axe himself and hacked like mad at the plane tree. Thwack, thwack, thwack went the axe, but the plane tree held out mightily. Then one of the scholars approached him and said gently, you won't get anywhere with the axe. For the plane, you'll need dynamite. No sooner said than done. Aristodemus seized a stick of dynamite, threw it into the crevice and lit it. My God, it was so terrible. The ancient plane let out a moan that froze my blood. The tree lurched and fell to the ground with such a loud boom, you'd have thought a mountain had collapsed. Right then, I saw Mrs. Penoria, white as paper. I thought that she too would follow that old plane tree, but she held fast. You wretch, she screamed at her son with all of her heart. You're not human, you're a beast. Not even Khan would have done something like this to us. And she fled the property together with the Mitrakis. They've now moved out of their house. They want nothing to do with Aristodemus. So in his mania to excavate the antiquities beneath the tree, Aristodemus thus demolishes the living organism that, within its long lifetime, had borne witness to all the vicissitudes of his family, to their triumphs and their tragedies alike. So 2 kind of footnotes here. The first is that by this time, dynamite had become very much associated with Schliemann's excavation methods, and was kind of a shorthand for referring to this method of archaeological destruction. And the second point, which I will come back to in a minute, was that the slave's monologue about the incident, and I'm sure you probably will notice this, shares much with messenger speeches of ancient Greek tragedy. The messenger here is a low status character. He bears his news to a member of the royalty. The speech is very descriptive and interspersed with stretches of embedded direct speech. And so I want to come back to this use of by Karkavitsas of a markedly ancient literary device. But the chapter in which this episode takes place is actually remarkable for its twin representations of great trees felled. Because the chapter itself actually begins with an account of what's often known as Osman's dream, which here becomes recast as Khan's portentous nightmare. Osman I, the founder of the Ottoman Empire, had supposedly dreamed of a tree that, and this is how it's described in the archaeologist, he dreamed of a tree that, like sky, canopied plains and seas, cities and villages, mountains and rivers, a tree that represented universal empire. So Karkavitsas, of course, did not himself invent the story of Osman's dream, which from at least the late 15th century lay at the very heart of Ottoman imperial foundation mythology. But he does introduce a new and very scary sequel to it, another kind of nightmare vision. So as the Khan sits moldering in the corner of his dilapidated palace and ruminating over the dissolution of his family and their empire, he slips into a vision in which he assumes the identity of Osman the First, and begins to dream his ancestors' famous dream. But in Khan's version, after the tree has grown up, a storm begins to batter it, and then out of nowhere there appears a cyclone of a man with a saw in his hand. I think that this is on your handout. Yeah, this is from Khan's dream on the last page of your handout. So this person greeted Khan with a smile and began to saw the tree at its roots. He sawed hard, fast and tirelessly. He sawed and he joked. He sawed and he snickered. He sawed and he sang barbaric yet triumphant songs. For the Eumorphopolis and Khan lines, the destruction of the family's link with the more illustrious past becomes enacted by, or at least envisioned, as the destruction of an ancient family tree. And I think here too, you might be tempted to think of the tree of Jesse described in Isaiah 11:1, the origin of this concept of the genealogical family tree. The tree of Jesse, which is so often depicted in Christian art, of course, represents the family line of Jesus Christ, starting with Jesse, the father of King David. So in the case of the Eumorphopolis tree, Carcabitsis' choice to make that tree a plane tree, a platanos, is like his choice to frame the story of the tree's destruction as a tragic messenger speech, evocative of an ancient literary tradition. A piece of the plane tree that Odysseus described as beautiful in the Iliad in Book 2 was supposedly still preserved in the Temple of Artemis at Aulis in the 2nd century AD. Pausanias tells us that. And of course, Plato's Socratic dialogue Phaedrus had served to turn a plane tree's presence into a literary device used by many subsequent authors to signify a shady natural gathering spot that invites pleasant conversation and philosophical conversation in particular. And the plane tree's presence, as the distinguished scholar Richard Hunter has noted, the plane tree's presence in the locus amoenus, that is the setting of the Phaedrus, may well have been inspired by that mention in the Iliad. Plane trees are famously long-lived. And still today, I'm sure many of you know, they serve as anchors and centers of village life in Greece. They're a regular fixture in village squares, and many a local cafe is called platanos. So by so violently destroying this majestic and ancient tree, Aristodemus in effect destroys a long-lived symbol of intellectual tradition and human community as well. His violence also severs the family's one living link with the illustrious ancient past, a link that is more potent and authentic than any shard that lies forgotten in the dirt at the tree's roots. So Dimitrakis, yes, he supposedly had cried, "It's just as sacred as your rocks," when he was pleading with his brother to spare the tree. But I think that the plane tree also has significance for its simple status just as a tree. So that is one of the many works of nature that Aristodemus destroys in his quest to unearth the past. It's beyond the scope of what I'm trying to suggest here, but I do think that there's a very interesting, subtle yet forceful environmentalist critique of archaeological excavation that runs through the archaeologists. The cold and rocky dirt, so prized by the archaeologists by Aristodemus, is repeatedly contrasted with the lush and the lively landscapes full of color and sound and fragrance in which Dimitrakis and Elpida, like the shepherds and shepherdesses of ancient pastoral novels, feel most at home. And that's actually that pastoral connection is one that's made explicit for the end of the book. And I think it's worth remembering again that the flurry of major archaeological excavations that took place during Carcabitsis' lifetime would have starkly altered the environment. I don't have it here, but you may have seen there's a famous photograph of the Acropolis from probably the 1860s that where you see the Acropolis and you see the excavations and you see these mountains of dirt as high as the Acropolis itself from the excavations, these hills of dirt yielded by the 19th century excavations of the Acropolis. So even as archaeology uncovers the past, it's capable of uprooting and destroying the landscape and society of the present. And this is a theme that will be familiar to many people with kind of all the work in fairly recent years to tell the story of Brisaki, the neighborhood that was destroyed in the interest of the Agora excavations. But it's also a theme that Karkavitsas had presaged with his 1892 essay Delphi, which I translated at the very end of this, in which he recollects a visit that he made to Castries, the village that had been marked out for relocation in the interest of the French-led decade-long so-called Great Excavation at Delphi, which began in 1892. In any case, in a later chapter of The Archaeologist, Karkavitsas will return to the symbolism of the plane tree as the most meaningful and authentic link between generations of the Eumorphopolis family. On the day that Aristodemus discovers the Statue of Glory, that's Doxa again, he returns home to share the news with his mother, Mrs. Panorio. And at this point, Aristodemus does not yet know that she's already died as a result of his ill treatment of her. But instead of finding her at home in the family house, that night he witnesses her apparition as a ghost among the excavation trenches, the same open trenches that resemble tombs in the moonlight. But the actual corpses that litter the site are not human corpses, but the remains of trees and other plants and crops. And this is number 7 on your handout. So I'll start with 7A. All around were uprooted trees, stumps of grapevines, ears of wheat, tobacco rootstocks, olive trees lying there like corpses. The property looked like the site of a human massacre. Dark blood ran, wounds gaped, broken bones whitened, clenched fists menaced the sky. Spasms twitched, groans disturbed the quiet. Everywhere the earth gave off the stench of rot. That stench seemed strange to him. He looked up in disgust. But what Aristodemus witnesses next makes for the most chilling sight of all. So we're told that right there in the middle of the property, on the spot once hallowed by the old plane tree, was the white outline of a figure that was kneeling down like a broken piece of a tomb slab. The figure reverently kissed the fallen tree trunk. Then it quickly arose, looking all around, and slowly rocked its head back and forth as if it were weeping over the magnitude of the catastrophe. So Aristodemus might see himself as the true heir to his family's venerable and renowned antiquity. But the first chapters of the novella reveal, I think, I would argue and have argued, that it is Mrs. Panoria herself, the mother of the 2 boys, who is the truest embodiment of the spirit of the family's past. Her status is such as first hinted at in chapter 2, where we hear this characterization of her physical appearance. So Karkavitsas writes that everything about her suggested that she was descended from aristocracy and had been exceedingly beautiful in her youth. It also suggested that she had suffered much and drank many bitter draughts. That is Mrs. Panoria then, who most protests the destruction of the plane tree and most mourns its destruction, even after her own death, reinforces the text's suggestion that the plane tree marks the most authentic embodiment of the Eumorphopolis past. That which connects past, present, and future, as well as roots, trunks, and leaves, lives in matter, namely the bodies of the plane tree, in living matter, namely the bodies of the plane tree and Mrs. Panoria, matter that encases a warm and dynamic living spirit. It's not the cold, stiff, dead rock at which Aristodemus directs all his passions and efforts. So I think then that Karkavitsas' archaeologist urges us today, urged audiences at the time, to think about the whole scope of human time, not in terms of of immortality, or maybe even what you would think of as the scale of geologic time that Aristodemus seeks, but rather in terms of something we could call tree time. Tree time is much more finite than geologic time, but it's also greater than human time. Trees can exist for millennia, and so for tens, or even in extraordinary cases, for hundreds of human generations. And of course, an ancient precedent for thinking about trees as both similar to and surpassing the time span of human lives is already famously to be found in the Iliad. So in book 6, when the warrior Diomedes confronts Glaucus, the Trojan ally on the battlefield, he first addresses Glaucus with an elaborate speech aimed at posing one fundamental question: who are you? And then you'll see on the handout, I'm not going to read it from the sides, but you all know what he says. But in a year of seasons, one generation of humans comes to be and another ends, but still these generations are linked by the source from which they spring. And here we might remember Elpida's lesson to Dimitrakis that even though Aristodemus cares only for roots and the leaves of the tree, It's the trunk that joins the roots and the leaves. Karkavitsas' evocation of one of the most famous passages of Homeric epic marks the third ancient resonance of the Denver poetics that I've mentioned here. So earlier, I mentioned that the formal qualities of the speech of Khan's servant shares with the messenger speeches of Greek tragedy. And I also stressed the Platonic symbolism of the plane tree in particular. Karkavitsas' use of iconic ancient literary tropes serves to illustrate the point that Dimitrakis, with Elpida's help, ultimately realizes, namely that the ancient artifacts and books hoarded by his brother are themselves animated by the same enduring Eumorphopolis spirit that has infused more recent history and which lives on in him. In other words, what I'm saying is that within this model, which is very much kind of if you think of German Enlightenment terms, you start with Aristodemus, there's this sort of thesis, and then Dimitrakis is an antithesis, and then we kind of reach a synthesis at the end that admits of everything. There's room for the ancient, absolutely, in this vision. It's important. So despite Karkavitsas' own commitment to the use of the demotic language, which I should have said this is written in, except for the character of Aristodemus, who uses a ridiculous katharevusa. So despite Karkavitsas' own commitment to the use of the demotic language and to the demands of modern times, as a storyteller, he reworks ancient literary tropes in service of his highly allegorical narrative. And in doing so, implicitly furthers the argument that one spirit can unite many times in generations of humans. So Elpida's own logic and her ekphrasis of her embroidery also illustrates a point that seems to serve well Karkavitsas' proposal for the tree as an alternate measure of time. Trees are living, so they're dynamic, and their bodies preserve and tell life stories. Written in their roots, trunks, branches, and leaves are tales of rainfall and drought, of fire and blight, of major stress, and of climate change. With time, stones and bones only lose matter, but a tree grows new life and changes each year, even as it withstands the passing of centuries. And recent literature and criticism have, of course, taken up these kinds of themes with an enthusiasm and urgency born of the climate crisis and the attendant eco-critical turn. So, for example, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the book, but Richard Power's critically acclaimed novel Overstory from 2018 not only set tree behavior and time in relief against their human equivalents, but it also inspired a torrent of critical literature that poses serious questions about the nature of tree temporalities, their philosophical implications, and the invitation that they extend to humans to conceive of time differently. For more than a decade, philosopher Michael Martyr, for example, has been developing a theory of what he calls vegetal time. But in Power's Overstory, the majesty and longevity of trees make them fitting monuments and memorials, and also tombstones, to more fleeting human lives and stories. And the novel's openly activist narrative ultimately suggests, as one critic has put it, that ancient trees should be saved because they hold memories of times that no one can remember, because they serve as witnesses of histories that are not recorded anywhere else but on their bodies. In the United States, the power of trees to serve as living memorials to history is one that has even become formally recognized, at least I think it's still recognized, by the National Park Service in 2006 with its Witness Tree Protection Program. Witness trees, the Park Service describes, are those flora of historic landscapes that remain in place decades or even centuries after noteworthy events unfolded there. Often the trees were young when the event took place and have now grown to be massive, silent sentinels of history. These trees often evoke strong emotions when we see them, knowing they were present during some of our nation's most harrowing times. I don't know, do you have the equivalent in Britain? Like we have trees that you'll see a plaque that this tree was there when the American Revolution happened. So this tree witnessed the American Revolution is kind of the concept. And now they're formally recognized by the Park Service, at least one may say. So the sentiment on view in this description of witness trees is itself, of course, an ancient one. So Scandinavian tradition, for example, attributes significance to warden trees, or very old trees thought to stand guard over the land on which they stand and the families who live on that land. And a similar notion also seems to have motivated Karkavitsas, at least on some level, with his portrayal of the Eumorphopolis family's plane tree and the tragedy of its destruction. It's precisely because of the long human history which the tree has witnessed that Dimitrakis pleads, however unsuccessfully, with his brother to spare it. Aristodemus, however, proves to be just as unbending as one of his precious marbles. So Karkavitsis's attention to trees and to the power of ancient trees as hopeful metaphors marks yet another way in which the archaeologist itself as a novella that I think actually remains evergreen, despite the fact that nobody reads it. The last decade has, in general, of course, seen this immense growth that I was mentioning of interest in the quote unquote hidden lives of trees, as well as an increasing concern for the ancient trees that are so often lost to human activity and the effects of climate change. Large, majestic ancient trees, now often described as charismatic megaflora, whose preservation is ultimately understood to be more, the preservation of these trees is ultimately understood to be more beneficial than their destruction for resources or in the name of progress. So we get more out of keeping them than using them. One such example, actually, one of the oldest living trees on Earth is a famous olive tree in the village of Anovouves in Crete, Ialiaton. This celebrated tree is estimated to be 3,000 years old, and branches from it were used in the victory crowns for athletes at both the 2004 and 2008 Summer Olympic Games. The ancient branches that symbolically linked the modern athletes to their ancient Greek counterparts. And of course, these trees are also mourned when they are lost. In 2021, the destruction of an ancient olive tree in the forest fires that ravaged the island of Evia made international headlines. News outlets oftentimes repeated the claim, just attributed to locals, that the tree had been mentioned in Strabo's geography, and so lamented the loss not only of the tree, but of the living link that it represented between modernity and antiquity. In a newspaper opinion piece titled "What the World Will Lose If Ancient Trees Die Out," tree history scholar Jared Farmer has argued that ancient trees are gift givers. Of all their gifts, the greatest are temporal and ethical. They inspire long-term thinking and encourage us to be sapient. They engage our deepest faculties to revere, analyze, and meditate. I think that more than a century ago, Andreas Karkavitsas already knew all this very well, and that the dendropoetics of the archaeologist not only enhanced the literary qualities of the work, greatly underestimated, he panned in his own time, but these dendropoetics also mark a significant, if underappreciated, intervention in the lively and highly contested archaeological discourses of the time. And this was an era that witnessed the birth of foreign-led archaeological excavations and the construction of national museums in Greece. Through the metaphor of the tree, Karkavitsas offers the promise of an experiential and dynamic approach to antiquity that stands at odds with the climate-controlled museums and libraries so prized by his novel Sophie, in a manner of speaking, and by the European and American scholars and archaeologists at which his allegory took, in part, critical aim. And you think that it's perhaps totally banal to say, but with now the Acropolis paved over in concrete for various reasons, that this plea for an alternative living means of regarding and encountering and knowing the ancient past remains just as urgent as ever. So thank you. That's a kind of an overview of the novella and a little bit of a slice of an argument that might be being made about it. So thank you very much. But it wasn't too short. Nobody ever complained
No,
about
that's
something being
great.
too short. Okay.
That's great. It's absolutely terrific. And if you're online and you have a question for Johanna, just put it in the chat and I'll read it out. So, do we have any questions in the room or online? Richard.
Thanks, Joanna. I'm going to, this is a very obvious question. Your passage about the dynamiting of the tree, or the cutting of it, and what it, unsurprisingly shrieks at me is Climacus's hymn 6, the cutting down the Erysichthon story, which Karkavitsas must have known.
All right.
He's there, he says, don't, the goddess appears disguised as priestess and said, don't cut that tree. Said,
Oh, that's great.
Well, if you don't get out of the way, I'll cut you.
Oh, right.
And of course, for Erysichthon, of course, it had very miserable consequences. But I mean, what's really interesting is that, I've forgotten But one thing which has been much discussed is this famous Cohen folk tale, which has a very similar kind of story. And people have long debated, is this a case of survival from antiquity or reinvention, or what is the discussion? What is the connection between Copernicus and the Cohen folk tale? Now, I think I was trying to think what it was. I mean, my memory is this was sort of published again, I think, in the 19th century. So Copernicus would have known this too. And so, in some ways, this story about don't cut the tree down. It's not just all the links that you made between the ways of talking about the present and the past, but it's a particularly potent example of a link between the past and the present,
Right.
because it may be, or it can be argued that actually it is a motif that turns up in however you think of the Cohen folk tale, modern Greek literature before Carcavitsis, as well as in this famous tale from Callimachus.
No, presumably this Cohen folk tales in like one of the polices, like collections, there's like of the biography of
was published in the second half of the 19th century. I mean, I have to go away and look it up, but.
I mean, thank you for that. No, I had not twigged that. So thank you for that, and I will definitely look into that folk tale.
Obviously, the tree in Callimachus, one of the problems was that all trees are sacred, and they have nymphs dwelling in them. And Erysichthon's going to take his axe to this tree.
Right. Well, I think that the trees and the nymphs in them, and thinking about like mediating divine, infinite, immortal time and human temporalities is also the hymn to Aphrodite. I think it's an interesting, example where you have the Aeneas being the safeguarding by the trees as a kind of, and I think that there's aspects there of mediation of then Aphrodite's time scale and the brief lifetime of Anchises. But that's really helpful, and I think that it raises actually another kind of really interesting angle on this book, where there's a lot that Carcavitsas is doing to suggest a kind of really authentic organic folk tradition that he is getting from books. There's that kind of like sort of he played the orality literacy kind of binary in this is gets broken down a lot. And it actually, in the beginning of the novella, Elpida gets represented as illiterate. She only knows these things from stories. But then by the end of it, she's teaching Dimitrakis how to read the ancient manuscripts and saying, like, look, this is how you can, connect Theocritus and our lives. And so in any case, what I'm getting at is sort of interesting. What gets presented as like a very authentic Hellenic or Romaic, however you want to say it, kind of piece of wisdom about trees may well be something that Carcavitsas, got from a book in this period, like a collection of folktales that have been written down now. Yeah. That's helpful. Thanks.
Yes.
Thanks for that. Does he find anything under the tree once it's been dynamited?
No, not particularly.
Okay.
No.
Because I was just wondering about the embeddedness of that time, the geological time, which is human, the archaeology, and the tree representing a kind of time in between. But evidently, that's not a theme.
Well, I don't know I don't think that he finds anything specifically under that, but he has found a lot of stuff like in the vicinity and just becomes obsessed with the idea that the tree is keeping him from something.
Okay.
Yeah, but I don't, it doesn't, I don't think that the statue that he finds, which is the big one, comes up from under the plane tree, but it's a good question. But I think it's all like the area in which they're working is compressed enough that it all kind of works. Yeah.
Matt and Lizette.
Great, no, that's all. Thank you. I was just wondering, on the tree, I mean, the obvious question that you probably anticipated in many ways, but how does the end of the Odyssey fit into this argument? Where, you go to the farm of Laertes and then there's the trees which you showed me. I mean, already in the Odyssey, there's a sense of responsibility, ecological commitment, family and generation that fit into trees. So I wondered, how does that, is that kind of?
I think so, it must be, I mean, I think that's, I don't know if there's like a, you know, if there's a sort of specific thing, but I think that that kind of mentality is definitely infusing, that there's a. There's a duty of care towards them, certainly, that you get in both cases, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that that is definitely part of the background of the mentality of, yeah, that's nice, thank you.
Thank you once more for that. That was fantastic. Thinking about early 20th century, late 19th century context of when this was written, it makes me think of E.M. Forster's Road from Colonos, where there's a plane tree at the center of that narrative that gets destroyed, and this is a perhaps time and where a lot of metropolitan writers across Europe are seeing urban development and railway expansion and markers of modernity. And Vernon Lee goes to Greece as well and writes about and focuses on the natural world over ruins. And this is maybe like a niche, slightly smaller bourgeois educated audience who are doing this, but I really like the idea of destruction of archaeological sites, destroying nature in the process. Is Karkavitsas concerned about urban expansion and destruction of nature in a broader sense beyond that for this kind of this moment at the pivot of the 20th century?
Yeah, I mean, he kind of, nothing extremely broad that I have come across, but I do think that in that essay, Delphi, you get kind of a glimpse of this, because he writes that essay at a very interesting time when he's traveling. I'm trying to find it here. Where he knows that Custri they all know that it's about to be destroyed, and he knows that he's kind of one of the last people to be able to visit it. So there's that aspect of things, and there is a sense of sadness around that fact. I can't find it right now for some reason. But he it's not like a broad position that he's pushing. It is kind of fairly subtle, and it wasn't something that I mean, he is someone who's concerned with the not in a kind of very like open over, you know, beating over the head with it way, but he's someone who's interested in technology and modernity. So for example, he's like interested in the introduction of the scavenger diving suits, like, and how those are kind of changing people's relationship, humans' relationship to nature and the sea, and that kind of extraction sponge and things. But I think that the clearest link would be his very extremely funny, sort of very charming account of visiting Delphi, which is really lovely, I think.
Forster was very aware that his name meant Forester as well. Puns on that. But let's go to Emily and then Anna.
Thank you, Joanna. Thank you. You and everybody else here so far has made a really good case. Well, not said a really good case. No, a specifically Greek tradition from Homer, really filming us down. I was thinking about the cherry orchard as another work where, you know, threatened plantation stands for the decline of a long established family.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it is interesting kind of how often the motif, it does crop up, I think, even beyond the Greek. It gets these particular flares of the Greek tradition when it's the plane tree in particular and things like that. But thank you for that.
Thank you so much, Anna. I want to read it now.
Oh, good.
It's a silly point. I don't know if you said something about this, but I was looking at your first passage in connection to the human massacre of trees. Like when Dimitrakis enters into the study and it's all books and it's just like walking into a tomb. Is there something about? Yeah, so I don't know, do you see anything about
I guess it depends on what the manuscripts are made out of. Is that what you're getting at, or that he,
What the books are made.
yeah, is that what,
Yeah, the books are, you know, made from trees and like.
Right.
like,
right,
How does that link?
yeah, unless they're deer or something,
Okay.
but,
If you read this one after like reading.
Yeah, no,
the
it's
Massacre
interesting.
of Trees.
yeah,
afterwards,
yeah,
you know,
yeah,
you know,
no, it is interesting, yeah.
Into yeah.
Yeah, the idea that
So-
you would have to kill trees to preserve something as maybe misguided, it's a nice point, yeah, that's a really.
It's not all paper is made out of trees, though, isn't it? Some of it's made out of rag and bone. This is really strange, weird, idea that a lot of the paper that we read, stuff on, particularly older paper, is actually made of human remains.
What was that?
That's what a rag and bone man is. It's sort of collecting stuff that would be used to make
Yeah.
paper.
Thank you, Tim, for that.
I mean, this is okay because he's taking the trees outside to get but you have like examples, I think, I think of Latin examples, I'm sure. But of like trees that are deforestation happening before something that is for the humans to make. And then
Right.
think of deforestation for making ships in the end, right? And then the ships actually being returned to the nymphs and turned into. So
Yeah,
I wonder
Yeah.
what tree, books can be also
yeah,
similarly. Use
Yeah.
the ship as a method, something that for knowledge.
right,
but
yeah,
it's
but
something
they're
to
converted into,
Yeah, it's hubristic anyway as books.
right, as it is to make ships.
Yeah.
Great, yeah, no, that's nice, I hadn't thought of, to think about that, because he says it is like a tomb, right, all that tomb sort of mustiness of the old books is like the tree carcasses, maybe if they're
Yeah.
in trees, so. I did find this story, Delphi, where he goes through his sort of whole account of the village, and then he says a truly beautiful and blessed image of village life, and yet one cannot be sorry that the archaeologist's pickaxe will soon obliterate it, is how he ends that story. Yeah,
Thank you so much. I was just wondering if you kind of talk a bit more about the kind of presentation of the Khan as well as some of the other like neighboring farmers.
oh, yeah,
Do they too have like are they too part of the tree trunk that's been a part of the history of the land, or are they kind of seen as this outsiders who don't belong there?
yeah, I think they're kind of, they have like their own trees, but they are seen as part of it, so there's. It is an allegory and there's a lot going on in it, and in terms of. Historically speaking, sort of two big conceits, the Ottoman Empire is the sick man of Europe, is really dramatized, and Mr. Khan himself is like physically ill, and but then also the Balkans as this powder keg. And so you get the farmers, the neighboring farmers are always trying to encroach upon each other's territory, or they're building walls to keep each other out. And there's a lot of kind of stuff going on about the territorial acquisition in this period, as boundaries and borders of the region are changing really quite a bit. And so I think that the archaeology is actually kind of an interesting, overlooked, sort of moment with, World War I on the not so distant horizon, but like from the inside, kind of what these tensions are feeling like. And there's a feeling of competition within the region, so there's actually a point where one of the Sophie, the wise men decide to leave the Eumorphopolis family. And they go to like a neighboring farm to look at that family's books. And the Eumorphopolis family Aristodemus gets very jealous and like salty about the idea that anybody else's books would be interesting. They're interested in Khan's books. They're interested in the guy who represents the Bulgarian Theomisitos. They're interested in his books as well. And so there's a lot of the tensions in the Balkan region in this period, kind of before the Macedonian Wars break out, before World War I, that gets dramatized. I think it's one of the most interesting aspects of the book, actually.
David, and then Daniel, and then Julia.
It has to be seen in the context of its time, obviously, particularly the Greek setup. Now, you mentioned that it was panned by critics at the time. And I don't know the answer to this, so it's a genuine question. What do you think they were more offended by the literary style, that they saw it as simplistic and allegory, not convincingly worked out? Or was it the politics that offended them because it appeared to be going against the prevailing idea of the value there of reconquering the territory and ancient minor that had once been Greek under the Byzantine Empire? So do you think it was a political opposition?
I think that there were, well, I think there are two layers to it. The kind of like, you know, knee-jerk reaction, how could you say these things are about the antiquities? This was sort of a more what Karkavitsas imagined had been the popular reaction to his book. That was sort of his understanding of why it hadn't done well. But in terms of the critics that he actually cared about, it was because of the quality of the literature. The people were really disappointed because after, and I didn't give any of this background on the author, but I mean, it sort of he's still read in the Greek curriculum for having written what was regarded as the first vernacular novel, Zitianos, The Beggar. And then so after Zitianos and after Lieri, the Louis girl, I think is probably being translated, that there was an expectation that he had these powers of characterization, of naturalism, and all these things were, you know, very strong. And then the archaeologists came out and it was just like such a like hate you over the head allegory that people thought that that was kind of beneath what his powers were as an author. And he was, I think, very hurt by this, that yet another very interesting and I think underappreciated aspect of this novella is that Karkavitsas was part of one never knows what background they give, you know, this generation of the 1880s, a generation of the 80s, like a real sort of fervent fervor around literary production, sort of, you know, we're talking about the gathering of folk literature, where there's actually a lot of back and forth, also between Athens and Munich at the time still. You know, obviously Munich had important connections to Greece in the founding of the modern nation state, but there was a lot of intellectual exchange back and forth. And this was the time that kind of Byzantine studies were being invented in Munich. And so one of the Sophie it's pretty clear, Alamanos, it's pretty clear that he was a very kind of a stand-in for a very, very important scholar of Byzantium at a time when there was efforts to incorporate that part of the tradition into national historical narratives. And so why did I get to this? Yes, and so we have actually some of Karkavitsas' correspondence with him, with his friend who said, you know, look, I don't think it's your best work, which Karkavitsas back and says, no. Might say that, but I actually have a real affection for it. I never learned another novel, and he just kind of after that went to writing collections of like folktales for in progressively staged textbooks for kids to learn demonic in schools. He never goes back to the real fiction writing after that. So yeah, so the nature of the criticism was basically that it's too allegorical. You can pass on.
Before we go to Daniel, can I just ask a question from online, because Nectaria has been waiting for some time. So the question is, thank you, Prof. Hanning, for your fresh, insightful take on Karkavitsas' novella and for your masterful translation of it. I was wondering about your thoughts on the gender dimension of temporality in the novella that seems to exist in the background of the notion of tree time you suggested. There seems to be one type of national temporality connected with modernity and men, Aristodemos and the scholars, versus another type of national temporality connected with women, Elpida. The former appears as fragmented, fragments of Greek heritage unearthed by archaeologists, while the latter seems to be more whole, the plane tree as a metaphor of the three stages of Greek history, ancient, Byzantine, modern. Would you agree with that? Thank you again.
Thank you, Lydia. Well, I thought you'd never ask. I think that there is a very interesting gender dynamic going on, actually, in one particular scene in the novella, I don't know what to call it. But Mrs. Pandoria, I think in the mother, I think that she's the real representation of this true spirit of antiquity in the novella. Whereas Alpida represents this kind of more Romaic, kind of Byzantine, sort of vaguely Byzantine, but the laic kind of tradition. And there's when Mrs. Pandoria, the mother, gets kicked out of her house, she goes up to Alpida's house. Alpida lives. She has been marginalized within this family. I said that she was a cousin of the boys, but the rumor was that her mother had been raped by one of the Khan family, and that's where Alpida came from. So you can understand this, allegorically, like, what culture had been like in Greece after antiquity, that it was diluted and degraded by this other presence. But so Mrs. Pandoria, when she's very sick, she's been expelled from her land. She makes her way up to Alpida's house, which it seems to be on Mount Olympus, and is full of like animals and handicrafts and all these kinds of things. And she goes into Alpida's bedroom. And on the walls are all of these paintings of scenes of the sort that from stories of the sort that Professor Holton is an expert in, from all of these kinds of folk tales and all of these sort of Cretan tales, like decorating the room there. And in this moment, you have this interaction between the two women, which it's crazy that there's actually a scene in this novel that passes the Bechdel test, where these two women interact, and Mrs. Pandoria is sort of like sopping wet, and Alpida like helps her out of her dress into some fresh jammies, and it kind of like gets a little like what's like, but if we read it allegorically, that like there is like the women embody some true spirit of antiquity and later times, that they can still kind of interact on this level and recognize the truth in each other, whereas the guys are like getting it all wrong by fragmenting it. But there's like a frisson, I really think, I don't think it's just me, to this scene between the characters that represent the true spirits of antiquity and of later times that are embodied in these women.
That's a firm yes.
I think so, yeah, I definitely.
Daniel.
Yeah, thanks, John. It was fantastic. I enjoyed it. I'm going to read the text now. But it just occurred to me when you were talking about tree time, that one of the reasons that eco critics are so interested in it is because trees seem to kind of code a version of history where the human is not necessarily at the center, right? So that the trees see everything, not just the things that humans do. And it struck me as we were reading through this, I mean, how much the human is at the center of the way in which Hippocrates is thinking about the tree. So I just wondered whether that broader non-human environmental scale of tree history factors into his thinking at all, or maybe not.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I mean, it's like, this question of, to what extent are they just being, is it still like centering the human?
Yeah.
Right, and I think very much so. Like, I don't think that there is much that exists without the human in this. It's an interesting question, but I don't think that there is much beyond the human.
There's no real version of the Bechdel test.
Yeah, there's no, tree conversation, not about humans. I guess. Yeah, I'm looking for this example anyways of the there you go. Of where Alpida and Mrs. Pandoria kind of this moment up on Mount Olympus.
Julia.
Thanks, Joanna. I was also thinking about gender, but in terms of, is Pandoria supposed to be like very beautiful or very seasonal? Is that something about seasonality in her name as well? That's just a side question.
If you see it, it's there.
Yeah.
I think, yeah, I definitely think so.
But in terms of this idea of the mother being the spirit of the family, would you want to connect her with the idea of the motherland, as in I'm just thinking about the funeral oration, but like the autochthony and the land giving birth.
Yeah.
And is there this idea of life that comes from the land as
Totally.
opposed to.
Yeah, I definitely think so, because when I was saying, earlier when I was mentioning Zitianos and Ligari, the other novels, and I was saying that Carcavesis was known for naturalism. I mean naturalism there is like a term of art to talk about the importance of nature, of, you know, feces, which is, becomes actually personified at some points in this novel, like as a real figure, so I think that is, I think it's absolutely, an important part of that. Yes.
Yes, we're still going.
I've just got a question. Thank you for the talk. I was wondering, I just made me think about the role of like the mother, and
Yeah,
because I think I understand rightly, it was written in demotic, right? Or he was like a demoticist, and I was just wondering if there's anything in that in terms of sort of like mother tongue and sort of, I don't know if Greeks had that concept at that time or not, but or if they had that term for it. I'm just sort of guessing, but I was wondering if there's anything connecting the idea, Mrs. Paneria, and mother tongue and the whole demotic language debate question.
oh, interesting. I don't know, I don't know what to do with that. Do you? I don't know.
I'm just an amateur.
No, I think
So-
Okay, all right, we're gonna get it, do you have? How explicit is that?
You mentioned Zitiano several times. It was published eventually in 1892, but the first version of it that he wrote was actually in Calaveras, because at that time there was very little prose in demotic. We had to enter poetry quite early on, obviously. But prose, fictional prose, was still very much until the 1880s. The preserve of Calaveras. So he did what everybody else was doing. He wrote this novel in Calaveras. Basically, he rejected it and he tended to do demotic and then published it. And his comments are very interesting because he talks about the language he had been writing as an embalmed language, balsamomeni, dead and you know, buried. So it relates to this whole idea, I think, of the heart being buried.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the language is an important aspect of it.
Yes.
Because he obviously sides with the demoticists, but he's still in a minority at this time. And demotic, of course, represents the language of the people, the uneducated, the peasants, if you like.
Right. Yeah, and I don't know, you know, the idea, so you're asking too about whether his mother being like the mother, you know. Yeah, it's interesting because it's not clear where she's sort of standing on these linguistic issues or what her representation would be, but it's a very interesting kind of Good, can people just indulge me, can I just read a little bit of that scene between, this is where, Mrs. Paneria has come up the mountain and she's very sick and she will die, and she's gone into Elpida's care. But so, Elpida says, "You're soaked, my lady, did it rain while you were out on the road?" And she says, "Yes, we got caught in the rain, but it's nothing," said Dimitrakis. "Now that we've arrived here, everything will be fine, isn't that right, Mom?" "Yes, my child," she whispered with a smile. And so they entered into the room, and it says the old woman entrusted herself to the girl's care. She was in truth very tired. Sorrow and weariness quarreled on her face, making it severe but endearing. She sat on the sofa, rested her head in her hand, and looked around at the heirlooms with pleasant surprise. Across from her, the white sheeted bed looked like a blossoming honeysuckle bush. In a corner stood a loom with a half-woven cloth, and next to it was the skein winder, ready to turn the gold thread. On the wall hung the bow loom and a lira. The bow loom was for the girl's cotton weaving, cotton for clothing, and the lira for songs of woe, of desire, and passion. The other walls were adorned with drawings, antique but wholly vibrant, as if the pen had been lifted from them only just now. One showed Arethusa in prison, showering tears upon Erotokritos's ring. In another, Arethusa suffered the blistering anger of the queen, while in the distance the king was brandishing his sword, ready to cut his jealous wife to pieces. In another, the pretty shepherdess was wasting away in her flower-strewn cave, yearning for the nameless shepherd. So all these kinds of things that are standing, that are more kind of modern folk tradition. And others depicted other sufferings, tender love stories with unhappy endings, as if the room were the temple of some fearsome god. Okay, blah, blah, blah. Mrs. Penoria gazed at the pictures and sorrow swept over her brow. Alpida stood before her, combing her silver hair and looking down at her without daring interrupt her thoughts. She then wanted to get the aged woman out of her wet clothes. She opened the armoire and took out some snow white linens. Strong scent of lavender mixed with emerald issued forth and filled the room as if an incense censer had been lit. Mrs. Penoria perceived the scent and smiled. Elpida became flustered. She thought she was smiling at the humbleness of the linens. What can I do, my lady, she said, all red like a rose. I know that if my linens aren't worthy of your body, but I have no others. If I'd known that God would bring you to be dressed by me so soon, I'd have woven you cloth from the sun's own grace. But I wasn't expecting it, and I'll have to make do for you. And she responds, it matters not, my girl, it matters not. Clothes do not make the man. This is a repeated motif in the book. The man makes the clothes, I know, said Elpida, and on your body, my own humble gardens will become the virgin's chemise. And she helped Mrs. Penoria get changed. As she helped Mrs. Penoria get changed, her hands trembled with emotion. This is where I think it's kind of. For the first time, her eyes beheld a shapely body, its skin pale as ivory, her crystal neck with its azure veins, her ripened breasts and rounded flanks called to mind nature herself, feisty with her fiery juices. Alpida involuntarily thought of Arsacides, and melancholy washed over her like a wave off comes. Blah 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 blah. But it's like, I don't know. Let me get you out of those wet clothes, and then everybody's kind of very nervous, and I don't know. So I think that allegorically speaking, though, it's like really weird to then take this scene and think about it as an encounter between antiquity and like Byzantium. Okay.
It does sound a bit like the Aeneid, though, as if, you know, the two scenes of, you know, viewing the paintings on the wall and, you know.
Okay, that part.
And then the cave.
Oh yeah. Well.
Yeah.
Are Antiquity and Byzantium married after this? Maybe. Byzantium thought so.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much indeed, Johanna. Thank you for coming online. Let's give Johanna one last. And we'll take Johanna to the pub to the